Chapter 10. The Magician's Book. The invisible people feasted their guests royally. It was very funny to see the plates and dishes come to the table and not to see anyone carrying them. It would have been funny even if they'd moved along level with the floor, as you would expect things to do in invisible hands. But they didn't. They progressed up the long dining hall in a series of bounds or jumps. At the highest point of each jump, a dish would be about 15 feet up in the air, and then it would come down and stop quite suddenly about 3 feet from the floor. When the dish contained anything like soup or stew, the results were rather disastrous. "I'm beginning to feel very inquisitive about these people," whispered Eustace to Edmund. "Do you think they're human at all? More like huge grasshoppers or giant frogs, I should say." "It does look like it," said Edmund, "but don't put the idea of grasshoppers into Lucy's head. She's not too keen on insects, especially big ones." The meal would have been pleasanter if it had not been so exceedingly messy, and also if the conversation had not consisted entirely of agreements. The invisible people agreed about everything. Indeed, most of their remarks were the sort it would not be easy to disagree with. "What I always say is, when a chap's hungry, he likes some victuals," or "getting dark now, always does at night," or even, "You've come over the water, powerful wet stuff, ain't it?" And Lucy could not help looking at the dark, yawning entrance at the foot of the staircase. She could see it from where she sat, and wondering what she would find when she went up those stairs the next morning. But it was a good meal, otherwise, with mushroom soup and boiled chickens and hot boiled ham and gooseberries, red currants, curds, cream, milk, and mead. The others liked the mead, but Eustace was sorry after he had drunk any. When Lucy woke up the next morning, it was like waking up on the day of an examination, or a day when you were going to the dentist. It was a lovely morning, with bees buzzing in and out of her open window, and the lawn outside looking very like somewhere in England. She got up and dressed, and tried to talk and eat ordinarily at breakfast. Then, after being instructed by the chief voice about what she was to do upstairs, she bid good-bye to the others, said nothing, walked to the bottom of the stairs, and began going up them without once looking back. It was quite light. That was one good thing. There was, indeed, a window straight ahead of her at the top of the first flight. As long as she was on that flight, she could hear the tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall below. Then she came to the landing, and had to turn to her left up the next flight. After that she couldn't hear the clock any more. Now she had come to the top of the stairs. Lucy looked, and she saw a long, wide passage with a large window at the far end. Apparently the passage ran the whole length of the house. It was carved and panelled and carpeted, and very many doors opened off it on each side. She stood still, and couldn't hear the squeak of a mouse, or the buzzing of a fly, or the swaying of a curtain, or anything except the beating of her own heart. "The last doorway on the left," she said to herself. It did seem a bit hard that it should be the last. To reach it she would have to walk past room after room, and in any room there might be the magician, asleep or awake, or invisible, or even dead. But it wouldn't do to think about that. She set out on her journey. The carpet was so thick that her feet made no noise. "There's nothing whatsoever to be afraid of yet," Lucy told herself, and certainly it was quiet. Sunlit passage, perhaps a bit too quiet. It would have been nicer if there had not been strange signs painted in scarlet on the doors, twisty, complicated things, which obviously had a meaning, and mightn't be very nice meaning either. It would have been nicer if there still weren't those masks hanging on the wall. Not that it were exactly ugly, or not so very ugly, but the empty eye-holes did look queer, and if you let yourself, you would soon start imagining that the masks were doing things as soon as your back was turned to them. After about the 6th floor, she got her first real fright. For 1 second she almost felt certain that a wicked little bearded face had popped out of the wall and made a grimace at her. She forced herself to stop and look at it, but it was not a face at all. It was a little mirror just the size and shape of her own face, with hair on the top of it and a beard hanging down from it, so that when you looked in the mirror, your own face fitted into the hair and beard, and it looked as if they belonged to you. "I just caught my own reflection with the tail of my eyes as I went past," said Lucy to herself. "That was all. It was quite harmless." But she didn't like the look of her own face with that hair and that beard, and went on. I don't know what the bearded glass was for, because I'm not a magician. Before she reached the last door on the left, Lucy was beginning to wonder whether the corridor had grown longer since she began her journey, or whether this was part of the magic of the house. But she got to it at last, and the door was open. It was a large room with 3 big windows, and it was lined from floor to ceiling with books, more books than Lucy had ever seen before, tiny books, fat and dumpy books, and books bigger than any church Bible you have ever seen, all bound in leather and smelling old and learned and magical. But she knew from her instructions that she need not bother about any of these, for the book, the magic book, was lying on the reading desk in the very middle of the floor of the room. She saw that she would have to read it standing, and anyways there were no chairs, and also she would have to stand with her back to the door while she read it, so at once she turned to shut the door. It wouldn't shut. Some people may disagree with Lucy about this, but I think she was quite right. She said she wouldn't have minded if she could have shut the door, but it was unpleasant to have it stand in place like that, with an open doorway right behind your back. I should have felt just the same. But there was nothing else to be done. One thing that worried her a good deal was the size of the book. The chief voice had not been able to give her any idea about the whereabouts in the book the spell for making things visible came. He even seemed rather surprised at her asking. He expected her to begin at the beginning and go on till she came to it. Obviously, he had never thought that there was any other way of finding a place in a book. "But it might take me days and weeks," said Lucy, looking at the huge volume, "and I feel already as if I've been in this place for hours." She went up to the desk and laid her hand on the book. Her fingers tingled when she touched it, as if it were full of electricity. She tried to open it, but couldn't at first. This, however, was only because it was fastened by 2 leaden clasps, and when she had undone these, it opened easily enough. And what a book it was! It was written, not printed, written in clear, even hand, with thick downstrokes and thin upstrokes, very large, easier than print, and so beautiful that Lucy stared at it for a whole minute and forgot about reading it. The paper was crisp and smooth, and a nice smell came from it. And in the margins, and round the big colored capital letters at the beginning of each spell, there were pictures. There was no title page or title. The spells began straight away, and at first there was nothing very important in them. They were cures for warts, by washing your hands in moonlight in a silver basin, and toothache and cramp, and a spell for taking a swarm of bees. The picture of the man with the toothache was so lifelike that it would have set your own teeth aching if you looked at it too long, and the golden bees which were dotted all around the 4th spell looked for a moment as if they were really flying. Lucy could hardly tear herself away from the first page, but when she turned it over, the next was just as interesting. But I must get on, she told herself. She went on for about 30 pages, which, if she could have remembered them, would have taught her how to find buried treasure, how to remember things forgotten, how to forget things you wanted to forget, how to tell whether anyone was speaking the truth, how to call up or prevent wind, fog, snow, sleet, or rain, how to produce enchanting sleeps, and how to give a man an ass's head, as they did to poor Bottom. And the longer she read, the more wonderful and more real the pictures became. Then she came to a page which was such a blaze of pictures that one hardly noticed the writing. Hardly, but she did notice the first words. They were, "An infallible spell to make beautiful her that utter it beyond the lot of mortals." Lucy peered at the pictures with her face close to the page, and though they had seemed crowded and muddlesome before, she found she could now see them quite clearly. The first was a picture of a girl standing at a reading desk, reading in a huge book, and the girl was dressed exactly like Lucy. In the next picture, Lucy, for the girl in the picture was Lucy herself, was standing up with her mouth open and a rather terrible expression on her face, chanting or reciting something. In the third picture, the beauty beyond the lot of mortals had come to her, It was strange, considering how small the pictures had looked at first, that Lucy in the picture now seemed quite as big as the real Lucy, and they looked into each other's eyes, and the real Lucy looked away after a few minutes because she was dazzled by the beauty of the other Lucy, though she could still see a sort of likeness to herself in that beautiful face. And now the pictures came crowding on her thick and fast. She saw herself throned on high at a great tournament in Calormen, and all the kings of the world fought because of her beauty. After that it turned from the tournaments to the real wars, and all Narnia and Archland and Telemar and Calormen and Galma and Terabithia were laid waste with the fury of the kings and the dukes and the great lords who fought for her favor. Then it changed, and Lucy, still beautiful beyond the lot of mortals, was back in England, and Susan, who had always been the beauty of the family, came home from America. The Susan in the picture looked exactly like the real Susan, only plainer and with a nasty expression. And Susan was jealous of the dazzling beauty of Lucy, but that didn't matter a bit because no one cared anything about Lucy now. "I will say the spell," said Lucy. "I don't care, I will," she said. I don't care, because she had a strong feeling that she mustn't. But when she looked back at the opening words of the spell, there in the middle of the writing, where she felt quite sure that there had been no pictures before, she found a great face of a lion, of the lion Aslan himself, staring into hers. It was painted such a bright gold that it seemed to be coming towards her out of the page, and indeed she was never quite sure afterwards that it hadn't really moved a little. At any rate, she knew the expression on his face quite well. He was growling, and you could see most of his teeth. She became horribly afraid, and turned over the page at once.